Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
Clean freaks, my name is Hank Balch. You're listening to season 26 of the Beyond Clean podcast, episode 7. We're going to be talking about instrument inspection today with none other than the man himself, Bobby Parker. Bobby, welcome to the show today.
Hey, thanks. It's good to be back. I feel like it's been a little bit since I've been on the podcast here. I've not died or been under a rock. Just been shoulder deep in education projects at Beyond Clean. So yeah, it's good to jump back on the show.
You've been getting on and off planes from Australia to Canada to every other state in between. I know you've had a lot of speaking opportunities through the summer and the fall, Bobby. I guess most recently, what were you at on the West Coast?
Canada, I think, was the last one.
Canada. Okay, great. Well, yeah, welcome back.
It was the West Coast. That was after that. It's hard to keep them straight.
I know, right? Well, they're two very different places on the map there. But yeah, doing some great education. I know you've been talking about low temp sterilization. You've been talking about washers and chemistries, Bob. But today we're going to be talking to you about one of those, really, really central skill sets in fighting dirty, and that's this instrument inspection conversation. Today, Bob, I want to talk about the training side of it, obviously, because you're not going to know what to do unless you've been trained to do it, but that's a whole lot easier said than done. I want to talk about the process piece, but let's start with the why. Just like it's good to ask why if you're being told to do anything. Let's ask why on this inspection piece. Why is this such an important part of what we do in sterile processing?
Well, you see that bear out in even the education that's out there in the industry. If you've gotten a CE presentation in your department with the technicians from a vendor that came in, they probably talked about inspection of surgical instruments. Every company's got one. Some of them are a little more snoozeworthy than others, but it's really important. It's really important, right? So I've often heard this process being compared to the people who pack parachutes. They're called riggers, and there are certifications by the FAA about putting these parachutes together, and it's because even a small mistake in packing this parachute obviously could lead to catastrophe. And in a similar respect, those individuals in the assembly area who are handling the instruments, they are the last people who are going to see and handle these instruments before they get opened on the back table. And so we need a degree of excellence in the inspection and assembly of those instruments to make sure that they are patient ready, that they're functional, that they're assembled appropriately, that they're clean, that they're organized so that the OR can use them. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, well, someone who is afraid of heights a little bit, when you start talking about packing the parachute, immediately my blood pressure goes up. Number one, it's hard enough to jump out of a plane. Number two, trusting that parachute packing is a whole nother ball game. But you're absolutely right. You know, there's a level of trust that goes in to these trays, especially on the part of our partners in the operating room. The assumption is these trays are going to be ready to go when I crack that lock or when I undo this wrap. But the only way that they're ready to go in a sustainable and repeatable fashion is if we get this inspection right. But before we jump into the training side of it itself, part of the inspection process, I think, that gets most of the love and attention, we're going to talk about it today, is on the clean side. Obviously, that's where the bulk of the inspection happens. But I want to talk briefly, Bobby, about, hey, there's a level of inspection that should be going on in a decontamination phase. Kind of talk us through why that's important and the kinds of things that you should be looking for if you're back in decontam.
Yeah, I find that most departments have those lighted magnifiers on every assembly station. And it's a big priority for them to carve out that time for inspection on the clean side. But there are no tools in decontamination to help with instrument inspection. And the expectation back there is to just move all these instruments through quickly. And it comes at no surprise then that those departments, they have a lot of instruments that get discovered to be dirty in the clean side and sent back to decontamination for re-cleaning. And our goal back in decontamination is to make these instruments safe to handle with bare hands without PPE on, safe and ready for inspection and assembly. And so we can't have that. So I would prioritize, if you're a department that has multiple sinks, manual sinks set up in your decontamination room, staffing it such that all of those sinks are being used. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have 2 sinks back there and only one person back there working if there's a lot of volume going on, so that we're getting it right the first time rather than hoping and crossing our fingers that they're going to exceed expectations, miraculously make it work, and then we'll just redo the ones that they mess up on. I don't think that's a risk worth taking. And then I'd have some lighted magnification back there to help out with micro instruments. And we can get into tools a little bit later on, but I think borescopes, we've talked about this on previous seasons, that if you have a borescope, you could put it on the clean side, on the dirty side. Personally, I would probably install it in the dirty side these days in order to help make sure that those lumens are clean before they go to the clean side, and just hope that if it's not clean, that the technician out there is going to catch it.
Right. And to your point about the borescopes, we are seeing more of those being implemented in decontam in 2024, than we have in previous years. Same thing around that lighted magnification piece, especially with the robotic reprocessing, that it's specifically called out in the IFUs that you should have those tools back in decon. I think folks are starting to wake up to that piece. But you brought up a great point, Bobby, and just kind of this assumption on what the role in decontamination, what it is when you go back there. It's not just to get these instruments through as quickly as possible, but to get them through with purpose, with the purpose being that they are safe to handle. Now, here's a level of inspection that we just can't get done in decontam, and that's where the next step in the process comes in, obviously. But I think just kind of communicating that to the staff, but also the magic word of allocating time to do a little bit more inspection. Even in a previous virtual conference we did on missing instruments, that whole question on how soon can you identify if an instrument is missing from a tray. And if you're not looking with any intentionality in your trays when you're decontaminating, you're not going to know until however long it takes to get through the decon manual cleaning, automated cleaning, and then it finally gets pulled to start the assembly process. It could be a lot of time that elapses before you have any clue that anything may have been thrown away or misplaced. And so, yeah, that step really, really critical, but you got to have the time to do it. So coming over into the clean side then, Bobby, maybe let's start on the education side of this. What is that traditional experience that a technician would go through in learning how to inspect instruments? And in your opinion, do you think that the status quo of training is working? Should we do it differently? Should we have different tools or training or layouts? Kind of talk us through your opinions on that.
Well, the reality in Kentucky is to be a sterile processing technician, you just have to be a warm body, maybe a high school diploma, and get plugged in, learn from whoever it is that's been doing it for however long, and turned loose. And I'll refer back to that parachute packer illustration and the certifications and the training that's required before you ever pack a parachute for somebody. In Kentucky, you have to have a certification to cut hair because they want to make sure that you can disinfect those clippers appropriately. It's not necessarily about styles. It's about public safety. And yet, wildly, we don't have that in Kentucky. And so status quo, I'd say in a typical department, you're bringing in someone who's not had to spell OR before. I remember asking that very question. I don't say that out of sarcasm. I had to ask my trainer, what is an OR? I've heard of an ER. So,
yeah, right.
Yeah. So you're bringing in people who've never had to spell OR before without ever seeing a surgery probably and being put alongside somebody to shadow for however long about, how we look at surgical instruments. And it's a really complex process. And so what somebody could absorb through training is, okay, I grab these instruments, I open them, I try to see if they're dirty, I put them in the tray, and I move forward. But what I came to appreciate later on in my sterile processing career and getting more certifications is you can get a lot of inspection done with a surgical instrument in a short period of time if you understand what are kind of the key inspection points for that instrument. Where's that particular instrument likely to fail? Where, if it's going to fracture, where's it going to fracture at? If there's going to be soil, where am I likely to find it? Is this the type of instrument that they cut bandages with and I'm going to find adhesive on the blade of this scissor? Those types of things you can't really pick up early on by just absorbing through osmosis or through watching your preceptor. And so I remember being a couple years into my sterile processing career and getting my CIS certification, my instrument certification. And I found that certification to be way more impactful on my day-to-day life as a sterile processing technician, even than my tech certification. I thought that was a really big deal. So it's a long way of answering the question, is the status quo adequate for, what we're doing for training? I would say in most departments, absolutely not. I think what we ought to be doing is taking material from these, vendor care and handling of instruments presentations or instrument specialist certifications and trying to build some intentional preceptor guides to help our preceptors be able to walk brand new technicians through those key inspection points and help them to be not just capable of looking for soil, but really competent at looking carefully at the ways that specific instruments are going to fail. And I think that would be, tremendous.
So obviously there's a ton of different instruments that are used today in a standard operating room tray, not even standard trays, I guess, even the non-standard trays. So we're not going to be able to cover all of them, but if you were to maybe lay out some fundamental inspection points in general around instrumentation, like what are those key aspects that you would tell a new technician or remind maybe even a more experienced technician who has just gotten in the groove, but maybe got a little too complacent? What are those things every single time an instrument crosses your table that you should be looking at?
Yeah, I want to answer that question. Before I answer that one, I want to answer one more question.
Okay.
How do you manage all of the gazillion instruments out there? Because you mentioned there's way too many to cover on this podcast. And I think it is wise in a training program to have a staggered approach to slowly introduce technicians into surgical trays. And so spend a number of days only doing your major tray and then add in your major ortho tray. And then maybe you get to vascular and heart trays on week 2 and slowly build out that tray specific competency. We have scope specific competencies in endoscopy. I think we ought to have kind of a tray specific competency for our new employees training. And I've even seen some tracking systems that will allow you to slowly grant permission to scan trays so that if they get eager and pick up one that they haven't been trained with a preceptor on, it'll flag them and say, hey, put that one back unless your preceptor is with you. So I think that would be really wise. So just covering some basic instruments, some that we could maybe get more mileage out of how to quickly inspect them. I think with basic hemostats, our Cryles and Kellys and mosquitoes, in addition to opening up the jaws, looking in the box lock, making sure that the jaws are clean, we also should look at both the front and back side of that instrument at the box lock carefully, because if it's going to fracture, you'll find a crack that runs from the pin that holds that instrument together over to the side of the instrument. And it's a hairline crack. It's hard to spot. And it could be on one side of the instrument and it won't show through to the other because that box lock is 2 different sides. And so look quickly at both sides of those. If you're skilled with your hands, you can actually check those by fanning the instruments out by holding 4 or 5 of them at the same time. So learning the technique for how can I quickly check and make sure I don't have any fractured box locks. There's that recommendation for how to check the ratchets, of clicking it together on the first ratchet and then banging it on the table. I think they say tapping it there, Bobby, but yes. Yeah. That's right. I personally never did the ratchet test in that way, but give the instrument a walk. Open it and close it a couple of times in your hands and make sure that the action on the instrument feels smooth. If it's really loose and floppy and you've got a lot of lateral movement in it, you can be pretty sure that ratchet's going to pop open. And so then I might check the ratchet on that one. And so with just a couple of seconds, you can do a lot more than just to see, is there debris hanging out in the jaw of this instrument? Needle holders, of course, those tungsten carbide inserts at the end, we ought to look carefully at those. Preceptor ought to be explaining that if this instrument has gold handles, it means they put this tungsten carbide in the jaw of the instrument. It's a harder metal. It's not going to lose its shape or its sharpness as quickly, but because it's harder, rather than smushing and being misshapen, it's going to get brittle and it's going to crack. And so we want to look carefully for hairline cracks and chips missing off of our needle holders as we go along. Rongeurs, like in our ortho sets, those big double action rongeurs that have the double jointed area in the middle. As we open those up, we're pretty good about checking in those for debris. One thing that we're not universally great about doing is looking at the spring tensioners, because the screws that hold those spring tensioners in, there's not a lot of metal there to hold on to. And if that instrument's going to fracture and break, I'd be willing to bet my last dollar it's going to be that spring tensioner fractured right at that screw. And you don't want that spring tensioner breaking under stress while they're using it in surgery. So just a couple extra turns of the instrument, maybe a half second or a second, if people are being disciplined with their eyes and know where to look, they can be a lot more effective without adding a whole lot of time in the inspection area.
Yeah, Bobby, you mentioned the test around the clamps, and I think that's just a terrific point about a very difficult skill to measure, but you know it as a technician when you kind of cross over from that, the book learning that you've been shadowing, you've been taught, and even like the eye learning that you can see to now you can feel it. If you've been a technician long enough, opening and closing the clamp, like you could tell even before you close the ratchet, this thing's probably not going to ratchet just by that feel and that touch. And I think that's a level of that experiential knowledge that even like hearing sometimes, if there was someone else that was closing a pickup or forcep and you were listening to it, you could probably tell there's some misaligned jaws there. And that's really, really hard to say. It's going to take you 3 weeks to get to that level.
No way.
But, once you're there, it can become difficult as a preceptor to train that because you weren't necessarily train that in a book fashion or standard fashion. It's just a matter of getting that experience, and then naturally using all your sensations besides your taste to inspect this instrument, right?
Yeah, it's good. It reminds me also of the Pakistan single-use instruments. We train people, if it's got a mirror finish, read carefully on it, see if it says Pakistan somewhere on there. If it does, suspect that that's probably a single-use instrument, though. Incidentally, not always. Some Pakistan instruments are reusable, but they also just feel lighter and feel cheap in your hands, but maybe not to a brand new technician, but you could begin to identify those even just as you're inspecting them along the way, because something just doesn't feel quite right about this one.
So, Bobby, let's talk real briefly about scissors, because I think that's another one of those common ones out there that's easy to maybe get in a lull. And there's some differences of practice in how often or how thoroughly scissors are checked. So what's your opinion on that particular category of instrumentation?
I think it was Rick Schultz one time give the illustration that in a set of surgical instruments, your scissors are your first impression with your surgeon. That's what they're going to use at the beginning of the case. And your needle holders are your last impression with that surgeon. That's how they're going to close up. So if we're going to build positive relationships with our surgeons and have them think happy thoughts about our surgical instruments in the facility, let's make a good first impression and a good last impression in each case. I think there's some wisdom in that. Scissors in particular, I think probably have the highest degree of risk with having a failed scissor that's got floppy action and it's not sharp, actually causing harm to the patient. Additional trauma, longer healing times, not as clean of a cut as what the surgeon intended, just because they're having to take multiple swipes at some tissue or twist or whatever is required to get the job done. And so personally with scissors, I would rather take the time to test that instrument every processing to make sure that we're always giving sharp instruments to our surgeons, rather than depending on the surgeon to identify when it was dull after they used it on a patient and were dissatisfied with how it performed, and then tell sterile processing that it needs to go out for repair. So you hit on a minute ago, the best thing that we can do in our processes for helping in decontamination is award the time that would be required to do that test. there's a lot of education that goes around how to do this scissor test. I see a lot of departments have the scissor test material, but it's in a drawer and it's not out on the workstation and it's not used through any of the time that I'm there. And when you talk with technicians, they say, well, I mean, I know how to do it, but we just don't really have the time to do it. I think the best thing that we could do would be to take a stand with whatever we have to do with FTEs to say that the couple seconds of scissor testing are well worth it, and build that pride into our technicians that we want to always be providing instruments that are ready for patient use and they're functional to our surgeons and not depend on them to do that quality check for us. So I know some people are let the surgeons tell us, others maybe identify one day of the week. Tuesdays is our scissor day that we test them. I think it's best practice just to test every scissor every time it comes through the process.
Yeah, that same concept can be applied to borescope inspection. It can be applied to insulation testing as well. That time component is a real challenge, for folks out there, right? We're understaffed. We don't have as many assets as we need in the trays and instruments themselves. And yet at some point, you got to make the hard decisions from the leadership side to say, yes, but it's not worth the risk to not do what we know that we should do or that we need to do just to save that time. And I know you and I both have been a part of departments that have built that in culturally. And so it just like once you get over that hump of implementing that, say, we're going to take time because this is the standard, it's a lot more easy to maintain a dynamic and then hold everyone accountable for that level of quality inspection that you need. This is kind of off topic, but it brings me to one of what I think is the most interesting conversations today in our industry around productivity, Bobby. The question is always, what's the productivity benchmark? What's the standard out there? How many trays an hour should I be doing? And rarely in that conversation do we hear people say, what's the standard and what's the benchmark related to inspection and the amount of trays that I can process? Because at the end of the day, if you're not as inspecting thoroughly, you can be far more productive, air quotes, because you can't see this. But what is the balance and how would you address, like I know you've had questions because you're a consultant as well out there when folks are saying, hey, what's the benchmark? What's the standard? How do you speak to this balance piece around the need to inspect more and a pretty good assumption that many of our departments are not inspecting to the level that they should? So if you implement what we're talking about today, Bobby, your productivity is actually going to go down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I warn departments that I visit with initially, like to bring us up to the quality that we need to be, we may end up getting a little bit less done initially. So there's a lot of pieces to that. One, I think it's from a benchmarking perspective related to quality. As leaders, we need to acknowledge that in what we reward and what we celebrate. So if we are measuring employee productivity, we need to also measure employee quality and have those two numbers live at least in tandem with one another as we're looking at employee performance. I think another thing is let's not expect our folks in assembly to do superhuman tasks as we're trying to get them to move through trays really quickly and also at the same time be able to catch all of these really detailed mistakes that the OR really wants us to catch. So we've got to grant them the time to be able to do that. I think the way that you measure that is maybe not most helpfully done by how many mistakes did a particular person make in prep and pack. But have your technicians who are assembling and identifying the trays, every time that they find something that's wrong with the instruments and they send it back to decontamination, notate that and track your trays returned to decontamination rate, because that's where the problem is. It's how many instruments do we have coming out of decontamination that are dirty, rather than just doubling down on training technicians who never make a mistake in assembly, which is not a good plan. Let's put more of an emphasis on reducing the number of dirty instruments that are coming into assembly, and you'll move the needle on your OR reported defects a lot quicker than you will by bringing in another vendor to do an inspection seminar for your folks in prep and pack.
If you look at a trifecta of you're monitoring those dirty instruments that you mentioned, if you're monitoring missing instruments, so trays are coming to you, but there's not an instrument in it. And that could be that it's completely lost or just that it migrated to another tray. But if you're at least notating that fact, but then also if you're identifying the instruments that are broken, this is one of the big data gaps I don't know if we specifically talked about this previously, Bobby, but it's real common in the processing side to say, hey, I've got this instrument that I've identified is cracked because I'm inspecting. I'm going to remove the cracked one. I'm going to go back to the backup wall. I'm going to put in a new one, but there's no data anywhere that says that you did that. As far as the tracking system is concerned, it just took you longer to assemble this tray, even though you took the in and out and you replaced that. Now, many of these systems have the capability to notate that, but to your point, if we're not cross-referencing the data of our trays and how this tray is actually showing up to us at that inspection point, then we don't really know how well or thorough is our inspection process after that part, and what can we do to reduce the number of dirty instruments, the number of missing instruments, and the number of broken instruments before they get to us. So I think that's a really helpful insight. As we close, Bobby, practically speaking, if you've got an educator or a lead tech or a manager or just a technician that says, I want to take this bull by the horns, like what's something that they could start doing next week to help their team start to identify some of these inspection gaps in their department and try to take a bite out of the elephant?
Yep. So rather than setting a broad expectation for we're going to do all instruments every time through the processing, I would start really small with one high-risk instrument. So scissors is a good example of a high-risk one we talked about from the perspective of it can cause harm if the instrument is wrong, or an instrument that's high-risk from the perspective of likely to be dirty. You know, borescopes was a discussion around arthroscopic shavers or flexible reamers. Good grief. How would you write the IFU to clean that thing? You know, sonic it, twist it, rinse it, sonic it, twist it the other way, rinse it again, sonic it again, and then throw it in the trash because it's still dirty.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, impossible. So identify what is the high risk thing that you want to go after and start there and make it the agreed upon expectation that that is the instrument we're going to check with this particular tool, every instrument, every time, and make the tool easy to access. So if you're doing scissors, get that testing material at the station in a place where it's easy to get to. If it's a borescope, don't have it locked up in a box in the manager's office. Have it at a station that's close by and easy to access. And then if you're finding success in that and you want to keep broadening it, but you really are running into that productivity wall where you don't have time and it's not an option to bring on another team member because, the FTE conversation and the budgets don't work for it. Look for some time-saving opportunities at projects at large that will buy your technicians time to reinvest in inspection. So technologies out there like multi-tray sterilization that might be able to shave some time off your prep and pack time with the packaging piece of it. Lean projects around instrument optimization and working with the OR to get out instruments that we're just reprocessing but not using. Anything we can do to buy a little bit more time in the inspection area so that we can do more of that magnification inspection and more of the scissor testing. So I'd start small and then look for ways to buy them some more time.
Yeah, even if you're curious about another time saving, Bobby and I did an episode a couple seasons ago on backup instrument inventory and just the huge time waste that is. If it's unorganized or unlabeled, you're killing minutes, like maybe 10, 20 minutes sometimes to find some of these items just to do a quick replacement. And yeah, getting that back into this workflow, Bobby, on like a shift-to-shift basis, that's a lot of inspection time that you bought back. So great ideas and insights, Bobby. Great interview. I think I should probably have you back again sometime. What do you think about that?
Yeah, here shortly. I'd love to do that.
All right. Well, that was Bobby Parker. You're listening to season 26 of the Beyond Clean podcast, the processes that save lives. This is a part of a 8-episode season. So if you missed any of the episodes, go check us back on the Beyond Clean app or anywhere that podcasts are heard. But until we talk to you again next week, we love this industry. We love what you do. We want to remind you each and every week to keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app. or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.